Good evening. So I'll give it a couple more seconds to see if anybody else is coming to join us live. But if you're here, it's lovely to have you with us this evening. Welcome along live. Okay, welcome to tonight's safeguarding briefing. Lovely to have you with us. We'll be here for about 20 minutes while I share some updates and things for you to consider that are coming up over the next few weeks and months, and also things that have been happening that you need to be aware of. The best way to get some information out of this, make sure you're somewhere quiet. Yes, this will be available on my YouTube channel later, but you will, if you're here live, you will have an opportunity to ask questions as we move through tonight's live webinar. It may well be as well, I know it's 8 o'clock in the evening UK time here, so if you have little ears about, you might want to pop headphones in to make sure that they don't hear something that you don't want to have to explain later on. And if you do have a question, then feel free to pop them into the chat box or into the Q&A box if you are here live. If you are watching the replay and you have a comment or something to share, then please feel free to leave them in the comment box below. I do read everything that is popped in the comments as well, so I will see it if you pop it in there. So who am I? Who's sharing with you this evening? Well, my name's Kate Young, and I'm the founder of the Safeguarding Association and the host of the annual Global Safeguarding Summit. I bring to designated safeguarding leads my almost 20 years legal experience. I'm now a non-practicing solicitor and I work full-time with designated safeguarding leads. Our specialist area is in supporting safeguarding professionals working with 15 to 25-year-olds and predominantly either in our training, which is all online from designated safeguarding lead above, or in our safeguarding leaders hub. And if you'd like more information on either of them, please feel free to send me a message. So what has been happening in the last few months? This slide has been on the last few safeguarding briefings that I have been holding. And yes, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. We do in England have a roadmap out, and we'll cover some of that in a moment. But the pandemic is still very much ongoing. Yes, the vaccine's been rolled out. Yes, we're looking at schools reopening in a couple of weeks. However, that is not going to be the same for everybody. There is a changing landscape, a changing picture, and whilst we might be able to get children back into schools, we are facing a situation where potentially more children than ever in a long period of time could find themselves in situations of poverty, in situations of hardship, depending on what happens for the businesses that their parents work in, and also depending on what happens as a result of the benefit system and any changes that come within the budgets that are likely to come across in the next few weeks and months. Particularly, we've had some new guidance as well. So working together to safeguard children was actually quite significantly updated in December 2020. And within that, the government has brought in some new responsibilities and changed some of the language. Within the previous iterations of working together to safeguard children, they used the concept of contextual safeguarding. That phraseology has now come out and they talk about being aware of the wider family dynamic. It's essentially the same thing, but it's more focused on thinking about what is happening in the wider family that could be impacting the young person that is the subject of consideration. There is also a new homelessness duty being placed on local authorities. As you may know, local authorities have not had control of their housing stock for some considerable time, in some cases several, at least 2 to 3 decades. What has been happening as a result of that is where young people presented, so 16 plus presented as homeless, local authorities might send a letter of support with that young person to be sent to the relevant housing association. They may have offered some additional support, but what this duty does is to say to local authorities, a letter simply isn't sufficient. You have to make a proper referral through for housing for that young person. So it feels like it's meant to marry up some of the discord that we have had for some considerable time, and hopefully will help those who are under 18 and looking for safe accommodation to better access safe accommodation. I'm thinking particularly here around those 16 plus who are maybe fleeing domestic abuse. We know from a Women's Aid report that was released at the back end of last year that women aged 16 to 24 are at the greatest risk of domestic abuse. So hopefully that will assist with sorting out some of that gap that has occurred where maybe young people have been in a refuge or somewhere else and they need that support to get into better housing for themselves. So definitely something to take a look at, definitely something to make sure that you are aware of the changes that have occurred within working together. As of this morning, there were a number of new documents released onto the gov.uk website, which set out the requirements for schools, further education establishments and universities to consider to implement ahead of the return to school on the 8th of March 2021. If you have not seen them, I would urge you to take a look to make sure that you are aware of what it is you need to be doing as a consequence of that. They are relatively lengthy. Some are about 64 pages long, and will be worthwhile making sure that you are aware of the changes there. Only the schools document refers to, schools and FE refer to safeguarding specifically. There's nothing specific within the higher education in terms of welfare and child protection other than around mental health, but these are some of the key areas to consider. If, as many organisations, you updated your safeguarding policies to reflect students being at home and the issues that were arising there and the different processes that were in place to assist young people whilst they were at home, you will need to revisit those policies to make sure that they accurately reflect the position from the 8th of March. Now, that may be some simple changes that need to be done, but depending on your setting and what steps you have in place, that may be quite a substantial job for you to do. And if you're in HE and have changed your policies to reflect the situation as was and are now looking at reintroducing students, you'll need to make sure that your policies are updated as well. You'll also need to make sure that any policies that refer to the safeguarding policy or have an element of safeguarding within them that were altered as a result of the changes because of the pandemic are reflecting the current position as of the 8th of March. I don't know why I can't say that properly. Make sure they are changed to reflect the position as of the 8th of March as well. So there will be this wholesale change, potentially for some that will need to take place. For those working with FE or HE, where students are gathering together in student houses, there are fines for student house parties. First fine is at £800, and I think the highest it can go up is to just shy of £6,500. So not an insubstantial amount of money in terms of fines for house parties. Perhaps the biggest requirement for all establishments is that of testing requirements. You will need to check the specifics for your particular establishment to work out what needs to be done and how that will take place, and also be aware of any safeguarding issues that arise from that. So making sure that you're thinking through the whole process. And again, if you are having to bring in volunteers to support these students with this testing, please make sure you are following your safer recruitment guidelines. This is not the time to let things like that slip. Please make sure for anybody coming in to work with students, you are doing your usual checks as you would do under non-COVID situations. It is very easy, particularly when there is pressure on to bring people in who may assist, but please make sure you are doing the checks you need to do in order to make sure that all parties are safe in relation to any testing and one-to-one scenarios that may arise as a result of that process. Just going to take a sip of water. If you do have questions, please feel free. So would it be possible to link the document that mentioned having a lead on return to school? It's the so the document you want, Chloe, is the government guidance. That is, if you do a YouGov search, or sorry, if you do a gov.uk search, you will find that bit of information. If you are on my email list, which you can sign up to on the website, which is safeguardingassociation.com, I will be sending tomorrow morning the links for all the government guidance. So you'll see it then. And also tomorrow at 3 o'clock, again, I will be running a free webinar on the updates, specifically around policies and procedures. So if you want access to that, if you're if you're on email, you'll get the link to that tomorrow in order to share that. Great stuff. Marvelous. So some legal updates for you, things for you to consider. I mentioned this in December. This case is up for appeal. It's quite a high profile case. It was all around gender dysmorphia and looked at the issue of consent. And the court did a full review of the law as it stood in relation to consent, particularly in relation to consent for medical treatment. So for those of you who may have heard of Gillett competency, you may have heard of Fraser competency as part of some of your safeguarding training previously. This case revisited that particular law, and specifically in relation to the issue of puberty blockers, which was part of the whole case as it was. The court said that it was doubtful that a child aged 14 or 15 could understand and weigh the long-term risks and consequences of the administration of puberty blockers. So that was specifically in relation to a medical treatment to prevent either the onset or the continuation of puberty. The court also said that in respect of persons aged 16 or over, the legal position is that there's a presumption that they have the ability to consent to medical treatment. That hasn't changed. That's been the case for quite some time. In giving their reasoning around this, one of the things they said in this big judgment that was released was that given the long-term consequences of the clinical interventions at issue in this case, which was around the issue of puberty blockers and how soon a young person having used them would then go on to have a surgical procedure around their gender. It was given that the treatment is as yet innovative and experimental. We recognise that clinicians may well regard these as cases where the authorisation of the court should be sought prior to commencing clinical treatment. So what the court was saying is, because the treatment is so new, it's still in development, it is still a learning process, that there may be some scenarios where in cases, clinicians, rather than going down the route of the surgery, route of medical treatment, and route of the lifetime long changes that could occur as a result of this, that's saying actually you might need the court to make a decision on this for you, rather than you having that on your shoulders, Mr. Surgeon, Mrs. Surgeon, Ms. Surgeon. You need to make sure that actually in those sorts of cases you get a judge to make that decision, and they can have a balanced view of all of the evidence around it and come to a particular decision on this. It's a really interesting case. It is being this decision is being appealed by the NHS Trust, by Tavistock and Portland. As yet, that is still being awaited. And I will share when that update comes through. But there is a really good section of the judgment that talks all about the law on the issue of consent. So if that's something you're coming across quite a lot, it's a really good revisit of what the law is at the present time. I have mentioned online harms a number of times in previous briefings. We're still waiting for this to be enacted. The online harms bill is floating about. It's probably going to be the summer before it comes in, and I will be delivering a free training session in the Safeguarding Leaders Hub for members about what that online harms bill actually means and what it looks like. If you're not aware of it, make sure you take a look at what it potentially means for you and your organisation, particularly if you're working in HE, and also if you are working in any sort of or any sort of platform that provides engagement between individuals. It's worthwhile taking a look at what that says. So things to consider as we come through what hopefully is the last few tunnels in order to get to the other side of COVID and of lockdown. I've talked about an increase in referrals for a number of months. As yet, we haven't seen them rise as highly as I thought we would. The numbers, however, are still relatively high, not much higher than they have been in previous years, certainly for organisations that I work with. If you have seen a considerable dip in the number of cases of a safeguarding nature, then you may want to consider whether or not you have got the right reporting structures in place, and whether or not there has been the efforts you've put in place to have conversations with students have been as effective as they may otherwise have been. It may be that simply your students don't want to talk. It might be that there could be a multitude of other reasons for it, but I would encourage you to look at what your numbers are and look at what and why that has been the case. It may well be that when Ofsted start to consider reviewing and going back to look at inspections, that they will be asking these sorts of questions about, has there been a difference, has there been an increase, what has been happening. Certainly I know in the early visits that were taking place by Ofsted, they were particularly concerned with how staff were coping and how staff were keeping in contact with students. So it's something to be aware of. Definitely something to consider is the increase in stress for frontline workers. As we start to look at getting students back into education, I know already from the education groups I'm part of, whilst teachers are really keen to welcome students back, there is a level of anxiety. And as a senior leader within that department, within an organisation, you'll need to make sure that you're addressing that issue. For some of you, you may not have had any let up in terms of the work that you've been doing, but bear in mind there you might have had a change in work circumstance in terms of work location. If you've been asking staff to work from home and ask them to go back into the office, that may well have a level of stress for your staff members, worried about coming back in again and coming into contact with people. So something to bear in mind, because the last thing we need are staff members who feel really insecure in organisations, because that will have an impact on their ability to work effectively with the young people for whom that is their primary employment. Also consider information sharing. How are you sharing? What are you sharing? What services what servers are you sharing on? What platforms are you sharing on? I did see some horror stories about information being sent via WhatsApp because they thought it was encrypted. I've heard horror stories of things being sent from personal emails to other work emails, so the information has been shared on several different places. I know that's probably against all of your policies and procedures, but it has been quite difficult, particularly where staff may not have been able to log into systems. But information sharing is absolutely crucial, that we keep a tightness around how that's done and what we do with that. Court orders. There has been a rise in the number of orders made in relation to private orders, so residence contact, special guardianship, those sorts of things. One thing you may want to consider as students are coming back is to revisit your enrolment and to be asking whether or not in the intervening period anything has changed, and has there been any differences, and are there any orders that you need to be aware of. Making sure that circumstances, are the children still living at the same address? Are the contact details that you've got still right? Because you might find that some of them have fled family homes to other locations, but have still been able to access everything because you've been providing work remotely. And it's only when they're coming back in that you're realizing that there's been a change in home circumstance. Possibly less for you to worry about if you're working with primary age students, but because you will probably have been told by the student that something has changed. But if you're working with teenagers, it may be that they simply haven't shared, and nobody would know because they've not been having their cameras on in lessons. Nothing's been shared, and there's been no real reason other than to keep your records up to date why a parent would share new contact information, because they've been able to get hold of the person either via phone or via email, but addresses may have changed. So something to consider, revisiting your information, your key information for the students you have on your roster, and making sure that's updated in your single central record. I'm going to put the last two as kind of a composite, albeit we know they are different. We are seeing a huge rise in mental health concerns, and not just within young people. We're seeing it within adults, parents, carers. It's a really big rise. And if you were watching any of the updates yesterday, you may have heard a number of people talking about what they are really worried about is a huge fallout in terms of the nation's mental health as a result of COVID. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. Now, the reason I'm looking at tying it in with unemployment and a rise in poverty is again as a result of last night, and we know that the furlough scheme has saved a considerable number of jobs, or it's saved a considerable number of people their income, albeit at a lower level. What is likely to face over the next 6 months is that as we come out of the lockdown following the roadmap that's been set out by central government, if businesses are no longer able to trade or they are struggling and they don't need as many staff, then the natural consequences, we're going to see a rise in unemployment. We've already seen a rise in unemployment. That is likely to grow. So be aware that employment is likely to rise. As a consequence, the chances are there will be a rise in poverty. We already know that many of our students, many of our young people are struggling with digital poverty. Many saying that even though they've been given devices, they don't have sufficient broadband bandwidth to access things in a live way. We know that parents have struggled with that in terms of accessing their workplaces as well. So digital poverty is a real thing. But you marry the two together and we are potentially in for a very, very rough ride, not least of all for those who are going through all of that. There are some services coming up, and I have just been informed of a new service that's being piloted in Manchester for women and girls. So it's from Polly. So think about if you are in that area, accessing that pilot as it comes through. If you're in the rest of the country, you will have to wait for that to come through. But again, I was alerted to another service, which you may well be aware of, but is aimed at teens and young people, which is Shout. If you don't know it, just Google Shout text support and you will find the details on there. But we know that services are struggling. We know it's going to be a difficulty. So having a bank of different services that young people can try and access, or that you can signpost them to, is going to be useful. And also take a look at what's available in your local area. You may well have services that aren't available in other areas that you can tap into with your organisation. Thank you so much for watching live tonight. If you're watching on the replay and have got any comments, then please feel free to leave them below. I do look at all of the comments. If you've got any questions and you're watching live, feel free to pop them either in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will come to those in a moment. If you are looking for more support with your safeguarding and are looking particularly for a critical friend, I can help you with that. I have an in-depth understanding of safeguarding, but I come at it from a legal perspective. I can help you with any questions and help in a supportive way to get you where you need to be and help increase your knowledge around this area. And this is our members hub, our Safeguarding Leaders Hub. If you'd like to be part of that, then feel free to send me a message and we can have a conversation about what that can mean for you. If you've got any questions and you're here live, now is the time to put them in the Q&A or in the chat box. If there aren't any questions, then I will simply wrap up the session.